Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, which was named by Poets and Writers a best book for writers. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Hi, I'm Estelle Erasmus, writer, NYU professor, and host of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm so excited to share that I recently gave a TEDx talk called How to Get Noticed in Your Writing and Beyond, where I share the hard-won lessons I've taught at NYU and learned as editor-in-chief of multiple national magazines about how to make your message stand out no matter the medium. But I also get personal in my talk. I open with a funny story from my past involving Thomas the Tank Engine, one that proves it's not about saying more, but about saying what matters. And I reveal a vulnerable chapter of my life that taught me just how powerful it is to be truly heard. You can watch it on YouTube. There's a link in the show notes. And you can also look up Estelle Erasmus on YouTube. If it resonates, I'd love for you to leave a comment on the TED site. It means so much to me to hear the messages that stick with you from my talk. Thank you. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, and today I'm so happy to have Dinty W with us. And let me just tell you a little bit about Dinty. He is author of the memoirs Between Panic and Desire and To Hell With It, and the writing guides Crafting the Personal Essay and The Mindful Writer, among other books. He has published essays and stories in Harper's, the New York Times Magazine, Georgia Review, Kenyon Review, Short Reads, and elsewhere. He is founding editor of Brevity, the journal of flash nonfiction. Welcome, Dinty.
Thank you, Estelle. I'm happy to be here.
I had mentioned to you before, but a funny fact is that I'm a contributing editor at Writer's Digest, and I have been teaching there for a number of years. And a few years ago, I was teaching the personal essay course based on your book. And so I'm very, very familiar with this book. It's wonderful. And I also read recently To Hell With It, which I believe is your latest, right?
It is.
That is just such an interesting way that you used form throughout. And I love to talk about structure on the program. But first, let's begin with Brevity, because I'm assuming 25 years ago, it was a groundbreaking idea, the concept that you had to share writing in 750 words or less. Can you tell me how you came up with the idea, why you came up with the idea, and what it all means to you?
Maybe it's groundbreaking in retrospect. Thank you for using that word. It certainly didn't seem like it at the time. This was the mid-1990s. I was, as most of us were, just vaguely becoming familiar with email and web pages. I remember talking to a friend and saying, there's over 1,000 web pages up there. And we were impressed, at that number. But I was curious about technology. So I wanted to learn how to use we had different names for it then. I think we called it the World Wide Web, which sounds very anachronistic now. In any case, I decided I would play around with maybe starting a magazine online. I didn't expect it to go anywhere. Actually, my early training as a literary writer is as a fiction writer. So I was a big fan of flash fiction, a lot of very short 500, 700-word stories were getting anthologized. So I thought maybe somebody should try this with nonfiction. And I started issue 1 of Brevity. I notified 20 of my friends. And I thought, this will be an interesting little experiment and I'll learn something about web pages. I didn't have any expectations for it. All these years later, the readership is huge. The number of submissions we get is huge. More importantly, the quality of the submissions we get from well-known writers and from writers who are at the beginning of their publishing path. The quality is just so astonishing because it's free and online, and because English is a very pervasive language, even overseas. We have readership. We have a large readership in India. We have readership throughout all of the, Asia, South Asia, Europe, certainly, Africa, South America to a certain extent. We've published writers from around the world. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't use the term groundbreaking because that sounds immodest, but it certainly has become something larger than I ever expected and much more well known. And I do want to say it's not just the numbers, it's the quality is really to look at what people are doing in the form and sending to us is amazes me still every time we put a new issue together.
I wanted to mention Writer's Digest. I know they do the best websites, and Brevity came in as #1 for nonfiction. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. I was pleased to see that.
Yes, it's wonderful. And I've had the honor of writing for Brevity several times myself. You're always so wonderful at sharing the work, even if you weren't the editor on it. And, I appreciate.
Let me just throw out quickly, because I was perhaps bad planning on my part, because now people get confused. There's Brevity, the magazine, which publishes short essays on whatever topic, literary essays. And then there's Brevity, the blog, which comes out every day and has essays about the writing life, the publishing life, craft. These exist simultaneously, and they both have brevity in the name. And I'm constantly sort of saying, oh, no, that's that one, or that's that one. But it's a wealth to have all of this going on.
So much information, from stories to the writing life. And so I've written for the Brevity blog because it's been like things about connected to writing, like don't blow up your life for a byline, and things about titles. So
the Brevity blog, and I do remember you writing for us, and I'm so glad that you did. It's as popular, or some days I think it's actually more popular than the magazine I started 25 years ago. Again, it's great because writing can be a lonely business. We're alone in our room with our keyboards. So sort of these different ways of creating community, I'm proud of, and I know people appreciate.
That's wonderful. And so you've had such a varied and long career, and you've touched on so many different kinds of writing, and you've done memoir, and your latest, To Hell With It, is just such an interesting treatise on religion and its effects on your life. And can you give a little nutshell about this? And it's really fascinating because you used all sorts of different scripture, and then you use that to tie into stories from your life and about your parents. And maybe you can say a few words about it, how you worked with the form.
I mean, think of it as a memoir, but it's certainly, if the bookstore had a section called Peculiar Memoir, it would be shelved there. I was raised Catholic. I went to Catholic school for 12 years. Catholics are very big on guilt and sin and hell. Protestants are as well, but it varies. The Jews, the Mormons, I mean, everyone has some version of this, so it's different from, but the Catholics have a very specific version of it that was put into a popular play by Dante, who wrote the Divine Comedy. I reject the idea that we are flawed human beings, that we're just waiting to sin and be sent to hell. I think it's a horrible way, because I went to school and learned all this. It's a horrible philosophy to ask children to live by, but actually a pretty depressing and counterproductive philosophy to ask people to live by. Let's just focus on everything bad about ourselves. I don't think that has good results. So the book is sort of my exploration of what are these sins that we're accused of. Many of them are like human urges. It's hardwired into us to want to gather things, but we're sinful for eating too much or having too many possessions. Lust. I mean, try to turn off lust when you're 16 or 17 or 18 or 30. It doesn't turn off easily, yet it's a sin. So to make a long story short, this book is both looking at my life in Catholic school, my life growing up with that cloud of guilt over me, visiting various representations of these sins that Dante identified, talking about religion and spirituality. It was really a book-length essay chewing over the whole idea of why is it so popular to think of ourselves as horrible sinners, and what effect does this have on us as people in a society? And it's also, I hope, funny and,
Yes,
as
I
I
was going
said,
to say you
peculiar.
have a funny voice,
Yeah,
Dinty, and you have some graphic
I
illustrations
I drew
throughout.
those. I drew those.
And then you have Dinty's Inferno, which is a takeoff on Dante's Inferno. And so you share a poem in there in the very beginning. And then the way that you structure it, through canto, each chapter is with canto. And canto is something liturgical, right?
Well, and it's a poetic form that Dante used when he wrote the Divine Comedy.
Tell me about coming up with the form and also your voice. I mean, your voice is very, I can recognize your voice, which is, I guess, the best, what a writer wants to know, because you're funny, you're a bit tongue in cheek, sometimes you can be dry. So tell me about A, setting up the form and figuring it out, and B, coming up with your voice and what a writer can do to come up with their voice.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll start with form and
Okay.
structure. I've tried in the past, and I know writers who try to do this, which is determine what form your work is going to take, your book or your essay, or, in fiction, your story. It's going to look like this, and then you just fill it in. And to me, that's often ends up in very flat work that feels forced. I am a firm believer, and there's, many writers who agree with me, Natalie Goldberg, certainly. I'm a firm believer in just plunging in and making a mess on the page, making the first draft as unwieldy and confusing as you possibly can. Because my first draft and second draft and third draft is me trying to figure out what the heck I'm talking about. So form comes later. Form comes much later. It's like at a certain point, I look at what I'm working on and go, oh, I think I see where this wants to go. And it's a conversation between me and what I've already written. And, in the best of days, what I've already written starts taking on a life of itself and saying, I want to go here. And then it's a matter of sort of listening and thinking what form is going to work.
So you wrote disparate pieces. So you wrote your Dinty's.
Well, Dinty's Inferno obviously came once I realized it was going to be about that I was going to use Dante as my structure. But some of the
Okay.
stories about Catholic schools, some of the stories about my life and guilt, some of the just longer passages where I reflect on how the religion I was raised in poisoned my life to a certain extent. That stuff all came out, and eventually I said, Dante wrote this ridiculous poem called The Divine Comedy. I apologize to people who love Dante, but it's ridiculous on certain levels. It's a revenge fantasy. Dante's calling out real people that he doesn't like anymore and sending them to hell in his poem. The language is beautiful, apparently, in Italian. I don't speak Italian. But once I realized that, using Dante to sort of as the skeleton to hang all of this on, then I started creating new material.
That's
Voice
good.
is a funny thing. I teach writing. I've taught writing at all kinds of levels for years and years and years, undergraduates, graduate students at the PhD level with big, big brains and fancy vocabularies. I teach now mainly adults who are ending other careers and discovering themselves as memoirists. The hard thing about voice is we're taught to be formal. We're taught to try to sound erudite. We're taught to use words that indicate we're intelligent. And that can lead to very clunky and flat and complex writing, which is not what readers want to read. They want storytellers. They want to feel like they're a good friend, or the most interesting person they met the other day at the coffee shop is sitting down and telling them a story. So for me, voice is sort of letting go of all that, like, I need to sound this way. I need to be smart and important sounding, and just sort of sounding like yourself. Regionalisms, things your parents said, figures of speech that just sort of stick with you because you like them. Fun words like flabbergasted that have always amused you. Voice intersects with point of view. So it's like your view of the world. I don't want to read a writer, especially in nonfiction and memoir, who gives me the agreed upon view of the world. I know the agreed upon view of the world. I'm inundated with it every day from every source. I want to hear somebody else's view of the world. I want to hear how you think, Estelle, the world looks to you. And that is an important part of voice.
I agree. And I teach writing at NYU and for Writer's Digest. And in my book, I talk about voices like you can look at a sunset and say, oh, it looks like, a rainbow as it dissolves into
Yeah,
the beautiful colors. Or you can say, oh, it looks like runny eggs on
yeah,
a
yeah.
plate. And that's voice. And people are like, oh, so it's really my worldview kind of on the page in a weird way.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
yeah, it's fascinating. And I think people can get their voice by maybe just leaving voicemails to themselves or, what they would tell a friend, the way they tell a story to a friend. What do you
I'm
think?
often when I'm teaching and I'm confronted
Yeah,
with the first chapter of a memoir in progress or the beginning of an essay, a memoir essay, and it feels really formal and like the writer's being really careful. I'll say, like, put that paper down and pretend we're good friends and tell me what the heck happened. And they start telling me what the heck happened. And it's like, that thing you just said, that's your first sentence. No, that's the way to talk about it.
it's so true. And what about Dinty? I have a lot of people too who come to me who are lawyers and maybe they're academics and they're like, oh, I have my stories to tell, but they get stuck, They're like, oh, how do I get it on the page? What are some of your tips to just get it going?
It's hard if you're a lawyer, an academic, all the various professions where you're taught to write a certain way, a journalist. It's hard to get out of those old habits. It just takes time. I was a newspaper journalist when I was a very young man and really had to unlearn, first of all, put I in a piece of writing or, to not to qualify everything and try to sound objective, to just let my subject or truth out. That was hard. I haven't found a shortcut for those lawyers or academics, except to say things to them like, you don't need to do that anymore. Pretend you're talking to a good buddy in a wine bar, not to the legal establishment. I
Right.
guess it's like stretching exercises if you want to actually become a long distance runner. If you want to sort of write this kind of writing that you and I are talking about, you need to kind of stretch different muscles than you've been used to stretching. And that's the muscles of voice, of storytelling, of subjectivity, of letting the weird out.
I like that, letting the weird out because
That's what's interesting about people.
corporate America, and I spent years in corporate America, and I've been a magazine editor in chief,
Yeah,
so
you
I've
know
been
what I'm
on.
talking about then.
I
Yes.
know what you're talking about. You have to keep the weirdness of you out because it just doesn't fit. Then you're the round peg in a square hole. And so when these lawyers want to, or doctors, who really have to have almost like you said, the journalistic impartiality. And I started as a journalist. I still consider myself a journalist and an essayist.
Mm.
And the idea is to break free of those constructs that have been around you, which I think it's a microcosm of life too. I think we are the most who we are and the most successful in our lives, personal and professional, when we break free of whatever those constructs we think we had to follow.
I agree.
Do you, because you have in your book a lot of prompts, do you give them prompts to bring that part out, the quirky, the weird, the personality?
It depends. I mean, a lot of people who come to work with me already have projects well underway. So I might not send them off with prompts to write about something entirely unrelated, but I might say, let's look at chapter 3. What's another way to tackle chapter 3 and sort of create a prompt around, you're telling a story about your childhood, but you sort of sound like a 48-year-old man. How did it look to the kid? Where were you sitting and what was in your pocket? Kids' pockets are full of interesting things, and kids are always listening to the world and trying to
Yes.
make sense of it. So sort of, little prompts like trying to get us back into our, not just our sensory experiences, which is hard enough for some people, but what were our sensory experiences like when we were 3 or 5 or 7 or 14? Because I could put Estelle in a room when she's 3 with all these things happening and put her in there when she's 5 with all the same room, the same things happening, and put her, this Estelle, and put you in there when you're 18. And it's an entirely different experience because of who you are, at what age you are, and who you are experiencing that event, that room.
So how do you excavate it for yourself? As you get older, how do you go back to those days when you're writing about them?
Yeah, the only good answer I have, because it's not easy, the only good answer I have is the more you remember, the more you remember. So I've learned over the years when I confront a moment and say, I barely remember anything about that. What am I going to write about? I don't remember anything. Well, I do remember that Aunt Callista had that red dress that she always wore on the holidays. And once I've got that red dress, I might be stuck for a day. And the next day in the shower, I'm thinking about it. And I go, oh my God. Her cigarettes. She always had a Pall Mall cigarette in her, between her fingers, and the smell of those cigarettes. And then it reminds me how scratchy her voice was, because my Aunt Callista was my great Aunt Callista, and she was in her 60s then. She seemed ancient though. Now I'm older than that. But back then, she seemed the oldest person on earth. One thing leads to another, and the more you remember, the more you remember. And then your Aunt Grace's voice yelling in from the kitchen, Callista, kind of comes in. So, I mean, part of it is just pulling on that string of memory and trusting it's going to come.
And do you have a lot of letters or, obviously we don't have text back then, but or no, it's just really pulling in.
You can also do other things. If if you're trying to write about your childhood
Yeah.
in the 1970s and you feel like that you're barren, there's not that many things you remember. Look at TV commercials from the 1970s. They're available on YouTube. Look at old Life or Look magazine ads and the articles just to figure out what was going on in pop culture. Remember what foods would have been on the table. These things might not be the linchpins of the story you're trying to write, but they're the texture of the story. If you can, drive down into the city and sit across the street from the apartment building your family lived in. It's going to look very different, but just being there in that space is going to bring certain feelings back to you. Go park across the street from your grandparents' farm. They don't own it anymore. You can't go in and wander around, but you can see the trees and the slope of the land, and things are going to come back to you.
I love that. I love that. The ads, the TV, even movies, right? Because they
Songs,
have
yeah.
all these people that check to make sure the clothes are correct and for the movies. So you can use all of that.
I had two older sisters, so much of my early childhood can be told through the songs I heard coming from the record player in their bedrooms.
I love that.
Me imagining, me being much younger boy, like, what are those songs about? Why are they dancing in the bed and singing to those songs? Who are these Beatles people?
I remember it's a little girl dancing to She Loves Me. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
No, I love that because I'm working on memoir about being the dating diva in the 90s and being a magazine editor and looking for love myself. And I kind of put together a playlist of songs just to bring me back to those times. So that's a great tip. Dinty, you talk about in the book, you give writing advice. And I know you teach it also. And you do talk about you should research what you need to research to make your pieces, I guess, the most authentic. That's the reason for that?
I'm a hardliner on truth in memoir, meaning you get everything right that you can. Talk to people. Look up what the weather was like. How much snow did you get that Thanksgiving? What was probably on the dinner table? What were people listening to and talking about in popular culture in the news? And then just doing the hard memory of trying to figure out, what did your mother say? What would your mother have said in that situation? Trying to picture the other people in the room. It wasn't just you and your mother. You had two siblings. I don't know if you did. I'm speaking generally
Yeah.
to memoir writers. And then there's memory, which is flawed. Intelligent readers understand that memory is flawed. So
Yeah.
when I say get it right, I mean do everything you can, give 110% effort to nail down everything you can. And you're going to get some things wrong. You're going to misremember things. That's the way the mind works. But don't lie. If you're really not sure of a memory, say that, share that with the reader. And I think what happened next was, but I'm not really sure, because say that. That's how you would say it to a friend. You can say that to the reader. Or you can speculate. I don't know where my father went when he left the house that night, but I pictured him up the block at Barilla's Tavern complaining about. And then, that's still nonfiction. It's the truth of what you pictured or what
I
you
like
picture
that.
now. I mean, you can do all kinds of things within the flawed construct of memory. But if you're making stuff up, if you're just
Right.
flat making stuff up because it makes a better story, then you're writing fiction. which is a great thing, but it's a little different.
Absolutely. And you talk about sensory language, using the language of the senses, right? So some people can like overdo it. They can just like describe a whole scene, but they can use too much sensory language. I think it's best when there's detail and then some reflection. What are your thoughts on that, on those two, melding the
We'll
two?
overdo it in the early drafts. You don't know what's going to end up being important. But the other part of what we're talking about is first you try to conjure up all these memories and all these sensory details, and then you got to go back and ruthlessly cut what's going to get this moment across to the reader. Be proud of the fact that you remembered all of that, or looked it up, or twisted your sister's arm until she told you. Be proud of that fact, but then ruthlessly cut it down to here are the beats, the term that actors use, or here are the scenes, the cinematic moments, or whatever metaphor you want to use. Here are the pieces of this story. They're going to get this across to the reader powerfully and efficiently. And that often means pulling back from all the layers of sensory detail, all the rich, wonderful memories of your grandmother's apple pie baking sessions in the farmhouse on summer afternoons. Writing is hard because there's so many steps. First you have nothing, and then you try to build up more and more and more, whether it's reflection or sensory detail or scene or summary. And then you have to start editing and saying, well, yeah, that's great, but it doesn't belong here. That's great. It doesn't belong in the book at all. I spent 2 weeks tracking that down, but it doesn't even belong anymore. That's where you're rethinking about the reader now and not yourself.
So I have to ask you, you've written so many books and you're working on another one. Does it go faster for you now because you've done it?
Short answer is no, but before people get too discouraged, this is true with any knowledge. I start recognizing sooner. Oh, Dinty, I think you're making a mistake here. You made this mistake before. Don't go down that path. It's just going to end up the same way it ended up last time. But it's not like you write a book or you write 2 books. It's like, now I know how to write a book. I'm going to write the next one in 3 months. It doesn't work that way, especially if you're peculiar and every book you write is a little different than the one before, which is the stupid career path I took.
No. So what's the trend now in writing? Because you see so much with Brevity magazine. So is there a trend happening that maybe we can pay attention to, or maybe we can ignore it?
Well, you should ignore it because if I tell you what the trend is, by the time your viewers run across this tape, it'll have changed. Trends are, people are always chasing, like, if you want a big 5 book deal, it's like, well, right now the New York editors are really hot for, so I'm going to start.
Fantasy.
Well, 5 months from now, they will have said, to hell with that. I'm not interested in this at all. I'm interested in that. Trends are tricky things to chase. In Brevity, which is different, it's literary, we've got a wide readership, but it's not like people all over we'll talk about America. A lot of people in the United States don't even read. People in the United States who do read don't always read for the same reasons. There's entertainment, which is great. There's information, there's inspiration, there's sort of literary writing. To me, literary writing is for people who really want to think deeply and reflect on the human condition. Why are we this way? Why do these things happen? What are the implications of these choices? Whether you go back to Jane Austen novels or memoirs today, it's really kind of, we're reading about other people's lives to reflect on our own lives. I don't think there's a lot of trends that change in that. Tell me a good story about interesting people. Call it fiction if you're making it up. Call it nonfiction if it's true. And it's the people and the depth of the story that are going to make it popular.
Do you think poetry is having a moment, or any of those,
Poetry is always having a moment.
I had Maggie Smith on the program.
Oh, Maggie Smith is a wonderful ambassador for, she's written for Brevity as well. So she's a wonderful ambassador for poetry and memoir and lyric prose are all sort of parts of the same well.
Yeah. And she got her start, or got her notoriety, with the poem that she wrote.
Yeah. Good Bones was the name of
Good
that poem.
Bones. Yes. And it's a beautiful poem.
People would say about a house that has good bones. And she was sort of saying that about the world.
Really great. Yeah. And so that kind of brought her to public consciousness.
And, by the way, a very hard worker. If you get 100 successful writers in a room, that's the one thing you're going to find out is they're all working really hard behind the scenes. It might look easy,
I always say it's like the swan. The swans glide on the water and you go, oh, it's so beautiful. Look at this one. Underneath, the feet are
Yeah,
pedaling
yeah, exactly.
furiously.
Even Toni Morrison, who's just in the pantheon of goddesses when I think of writers, she said, "Yeah, it's my job to make it look easy. It's not. I struggle. I bleed. I rip my pages apart, and then when I present them to the world, my job is to simplify them so it looks like it was easy for me to write that, but it wasn't."
It is hard work. I've had Cheryl Strayed on the program, with her beautiful books that came out of a lot of grief. And you
Yeah,
have a lot of grief in your life, in your early life, in your childhood, and
yeah.
you're funny. How does the two?
It's the oldest story in the book. That's how I learned to survive. That was my survival mechanism in my big,
Were
messy,
you
and
the
somewhat
class clown?
depressive childhood. I was the guy in the back of the class who muttered things under his breath, and people laughed, and then the nun couldn't tell who muttered it,
I always liked that
which is
guy.
a little different than the class clown, who's in the front of the class, jumping up and down with a red nose and getting paddled every day.
Right, because it was your Catholic upbringing. So
Yeah.
the nuns surrounding you, I suppose, right? Yes,
They were not afraid to smack you
with a ruler,
with a
right?
board, with a board. Yeah.
I'm just digressing, but there was a point in my high school where the girls came over, maybe it was junior high, from the Catholic school, and they were once they were out of the nuns' purview, they were the wildest girls.
Yeah. Pendulum had to swing the other way.
Yeah, that much pressure creates the opposite effect, right? It's the rebellion that came out. Yeah. They probably went back to, after they had the moments out,
Some of them did, some of them didn't.
possibly. And for Brevity magazine, I know the Brevity blog doesn't pay. Does Brevity magazine pay?
We do. It's $45 for each accepted essay, which since the essays are so short, it's actually a pretty good rate
It's
by
a,
word, but
and the
it'll
writer
get,
owns the rights. The
yeah,
writer
yeah,
keeps the
yeah.
rights.
We have
Okay.
one-time rights, but then they revert directly to the writer, and we send enough money that you and your loved one can have a Chinese meal
Right.
to celebrate.
Maybe not in a big city, but
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah.
that's wonderful. And I'll share the guidelines in the show notes of, how to get your work in possibly. This has been wonderful. Is there anything that I didn't ask you, Dinty, that you want to share?
No, but I saw your dog in the background. What's your dog's name?
Oh, her name is Rose, and
She,
she's a Havanese, and she's
she,
5 years old. She's very,
she pranced by those open door in the windows there. It has a
she does
lovely
not
tail.
want to be forgotten.
She has a lovely tail.
Are you a dog lover? Do you like dogs?
I love animals.
Right, right. I think I heard that or read that in one of your pieces. Polar bears? Is
I'm
that
afraid of polar bears.
you're afraid of
So
polar
I
bears?
actually worked in a zoo for a few summers, and the polar bears are the meanest, most bloodthirsty animals on
And
the
they
planet, I believe.
wow, they look so cute. I thought that was hippopotamus. I thought hippopotamus were
Oh,
really
I
mean.
guess, well, I don't know. I never worked by the hippopotamus, but I have mixed feelings about zoos. They're cages and prisons for animals, but when we were young, we accepted them as fun places to go. But
Yeah,
working behind the scenes around a lot of animals was fascinating, but you had to be really careful around the polar bears. You could not
yeah.
let your guard down for a second.
Wow, that's sort of a microcosm of some people in the world. This has really been tremendous, and you're wonderful. And I'm going to share,
Yeah,
your website and all the
it's
information. How
it's
anyone,
late February. I don't know when people are going to see this. It's late February, and the crocuses and daffodils are coming. That's what I'm thinking about right now.
oh,
Spring.
and so spring is a bloom.
Well, not yet,
Almost.
not yet, but I can see it.
Oh, that's good.
I
It's
now
almost
believe it's coming.
it's like early writing, right? You
Yeah,
know
yeah.
something's coming that's good and it's going to be colorful and beautiful, but right now it's kind of drab and dull and you're
Maybe
making
that's how you
it
asked me earlier how it gets easier. I've lived through more than 68 springs now. So it's easy for me to believe in the middle of winter that spring will actually come. I've struggled through so many pieces of writing that seemed totally broken and impossible halfway through. And I'd sort of pushed, and then I ended up with something that I liked, that got published, that people liked. So maybe that's one of the things that gets easier as you work longer as a writer is you start to have a little bit of faith that there is the other side where this piece of writing, which is just you're just pulling your hair out, where
faith.
this piece of writing is going to It's
That's
going to
like
find its
segueing
form.
back to your book.
Going to find its form and find its shape.
I love that. That's really beautiful and inspiring words. And we could definitely end on that. Thank you so much, Dinty.
Thank you, Estelle.
It's really been a pleasure. Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.